Hello everyone, welcome to yet another biology practical session. In today's session, we will learn about the water holding capacity of soil. In this experiment, the aim is to determine the water holding capacity of the given soil samples. Before we begin with the experiment, let us first understand what water holding capacity of soil means. In any soil, there will be soil particles, right? So the size of the soil particles varies in different types of soils. You may be aware of sand and clay as two different types of soils. In sand, the size of the soil particles is bigger compared to clay, right? So when the size of the soil particles is big, the space between these particles is more. Therefore, the space between the soil particles in sand is going to be greater than the space between the soil particles in clay. Whenever you add water to the soil particles have the ability to hold on to some water physically against the forces of gravity by cohesive forces. Now, this ability of the soil to hold on to water particles between the spaces in the soil particles is known as water holding capacity. Now, if you look at sand and soil, in the sand, because the spaces are more, the soil will not be able to hold on to much water, and the water will percolate down within the soil spaces and reach the lower layers of the water table. Whereas when you look at clay, the soil particles are small and the spaces between the soil particles is also small. Therefore, clay will be better able to hold on to water particles within the spaces between the soil particles. Now, as a result, because clay has better ability to hold on to water particles, the water holding capacity of clay is said to be greater than the water holding capacity of soil. Okay? Now, in this experiment, we have two soil samples. We will be testing the water holding capacity in both these soil samples, and eventually I will tell you about what formula you can use to determine the water holding capacity of any given soil sample. Now, why do you think determining the water holding capacity of any random soil sample is important? It's important because plants get their water requirement for photosynthesis from the soil. They also get most of their minerals from the soil. Now, plants absorb many of these minerals in a solution form. So, the minerals that are present within the soil particles dissolve within the water present within the soil particles, and that as a solution is taken up by the plant. If the soil is not able to hold on to water, then the plant may not grow very well there. Okay? In order for the plant to grow well, the soil in which it is going to grow needs to have a good amount of water holding capacity. Okay? So, that is the reason why we determine water holding capacity of soils. Before we begin with the experiment, I will brief you about all the requirements for the experiment. We need 2 measuring jars, 2 funnels, Whatman filter paper, 2 of these, 2 soil samples. As you can see, this soil sample is slightly brown, dark brown in color. This sample is obtained from the garden. This soil sample, which is light brown in color, almost beige-like, this is sandy. If you can look at this, you can make out the difference. The soil particles in this is very small, whereas in this, the soil particles are comparatively large. So as you can see here, the spaces between the soil particles in this particular sample will be larger, and the space between the soil particles in this sample will be smaller. As a result, like I already told you, you can already expect that the water holding capacity in this will be lesser than the water holding capacity in this. You must always remember that the water holding capacity is inversely proportional to the size of the soil particles. If the size of the soil particles is big, then the water holding capacity of that particular soil will be less. If the size of the soil particles is small, then that kind of soil will be able to hold on to more water. And after you have collected the soil from 2 separate locations like I have now, it's important to dry it, clean it because the soil might have some dried leaves and twigs. Clean it and then dry it. You can either dry it in the sun or you can dry it in the oven. After you have dried it, you have to measure equal quantities of both soils. Okay, for that you will need a weighing scale. The samples that I have right now are already weighed. So I have 50 grams of each one of these samples. Also, I will require water, because the whole idea of this experiment is to test how much water the soil particles will be able to hold. So water is required. Again, water I have in 2 beakers. As you can see, both the beakers have 200 ml of water. I am going to use the same amount of water for both soils, and also we must ensure that both the soil samples have to be of equal weight. Let us now begin with the experiment. What I am first going to do is place these 2 funnels in these measuring cylinders. After which, I am going to take this Wortman filter paper, fold it in half, again fold it in half. Now I get a cone. This cone I am going to place into these funnels. After I have placed the cones into the funnels, I am going to add soil samples. The one on my right, let me designate it as sample A, and the one on my left will be designated as sample B. Sample A is going to be the roadside soil. Very carefully pour it into the Wortman filter paper, the cone that you have made out of the filter paper. Now I am going to add 200 ml of water into each of these. I had allowed the water from the soil sample to drip into the measuring jars since the last couple minutes. As you can see now, there's more water found in jar A, which had the sample from the roadside soil, and here we have sample B, which has the garden soil. It's very obvious that the volume of water in sample A is greater than the volume in sample B. What this indicates is that the soil in sample A has retained less water and most of it has dripped into the jar. Whereas in sample B, the garden soil has retained comparatively greater amount of water within its soil spaces and lesser volume of water has dripped into the cylinder. In order to measure the water holding capacity, we first need to tabulate the weight of the soil. As I have told you before, both the soil samples were of equal weight. Both of them were 50 grams. Right? So this is given by capital letter Z. Z indicates the weight of the soil sample. So it is measured in grams. The unit here is gram. In the next column, we have water added to the soil. Again, into both the samples, I had added equal volume of water, which is 200 ml. Now this is represented by capital letter A. In the next volume, we have to write how much of the water that I had added has dripped into the measuring cylinder. So this is this volume that you see in the measuring cylinder after the water has dripped down from the soil. So in the first sample, the roadside soil that had dripped down 180 ml of water, whereas the garden soil 150 ml of water was found within the measuring cylinder. Now this volume is represented by the capital letter B. In the next column, you have to find out how much of water was absorbed by the soil or was retained by the soil. So you will have to subtract B from A. So here it is 200 minus 180, which is equal to 20 ml. Here it is 200 ml minus 150 ml, which is equal to 50 ml. Now this indicates how much of the water was retained by the soil. In order to determine the water holding capacity, the formula is A minus B, this volume, divided by Z, which is the weight of the soil we had started with. So here it is going to be 20 ml, which is the water retained by the soil, divided by 50 grams, which is the weight of the soil. Here it is 50 ml water retained and 50 grams the initial weight. So this will be equal to 0.4 ml per gram. The unit is important. Here it is going to be 1 ml per gram. Obviously, 1 is greater than 0.4. Therefore, the water holding capacity in the second sample, which is the garden soil, is greater than the water holding capacity in the roadside soil.